So, a little bit about ancient music. Um, the biggest problem with music history, as far as ancient music, like before the Christian church took over, was that we don't know what it sounded like at all, and they never wrote it down. And so, those are the biggest challenges that we have as music historians, trying to figure out what things actually sounded like and how it worked. So let's go ahead and jump in and go through this. The earliest evidence of music are actually preserved instruments. So on the screen there, you see some of this evidence. There's hieroglyphics. There's also artifacts that have been found. There's a bone flute over there. Other things have been found, such as rattles and drums, like with dried animal skin just stretched over, an open hoop. And then cave paintings are also showing instruments. So this bowl lyre, which is this one right here, this was found in about where they think the city of Ur is, Ur, and that's in Mesopotamia, where the first humans lived, and that's also talked about in the Bible. So that's some evidence of early music that we have. Here's just a map, of how we think some things may have been back in super early, 4 and 5,000 years ago. You see over here, here's the place where Ur is, and this is, the Fertile Crescent where humans first came from. A lot of Bible stories happening here. Here's Babylon. Abraham left and traveled over here to Palestine. And this is a lot of these things that we have found from that have been well preserved. So the biggest way that music was passed on was by the great oral tradition. That's teaching it orally by mouth, and then orally by hearing it. And so they would pass on these songs. They would learn it, and they would have to teach it to someone. And because of course they didn't really write things down very much, and even if it was, they would also have to talk about it. So written sources have been found. In 2500 BC, there is a list of words for instruments, for tuning, performing techniques, genres, etc. And from these sources that we have found, music was used as it is today. And they'd have music set aside for weddings, in taverns, feasts, and also, praise and worship and hymns to God. For example, the Book of Psalms is an entire book of lyrics that were written down and sung. We don't know how it sounded, but they were sung. You imagine also they had some mastodon hunting songs. There is evidence of an Egyptian lullaby that has been found on some stone tablets. And a question for you, if you know this, who sang these Egyptian lullabies to their babies? Their mummies. I hope you appreciate that. Sorry. So by 1800 BC, the Babylonians began to write down their music knowledge. And this is where we get kind of, the first written evidence. They had developed seven-note diatonic scales. So diatonic means that they all kind of fit into a key signature and those sorts of things. And we actually use these scales today. They'll come back into play here later on. So, for example, a seven-note diatonic scale sounds like this. So I actually played 8 notes there, but we call it 7 because that 8th note is actually just a repeat of the first one. That's essentially a scale starting on Do. Here's a second diatonic scale. This one starts on Re. And then they have another one that starts on Mi. Of course, they didn't have the Do, Re, Mi's like we have to now, but it's the same idea. A scale that starts on Do, another scale that starts on Re and goes up to Re, and those sorts of things. So this is the Babylonian influence. So the Greek influence. The Greeks were actually some of the best at actually documenting their own history. And so by now metal was being used. You had the Bronze Age, the Brass Age, those sorts of things. And instruments started to include more, fancy instruments. Harps, panpipes. They actually made some horns, some cymbals, etc. And the Greeks were, we have found a lot of evidence the Greeks were very good at documenting themselves, and so we can know a lot of things. The lyre was the most common Greek instrument. The lyre is this little, oh dear, sorry about that. Go back. I scrolled all of a sudden. I did not mean to do that. Shoot. Here it is. Right here, this is a old Greek lyre, and they would attach a strap to this, and you would rest it on one hip, and then you would play it, pluck it, kind of like a maybe a guitar, but all the notes were different notes, so you'd have to make sure and pick the right one. So kind of like a harp. This is a band lyre, and so you see the shape of the band lyre mimics the shape of lyres that we have found in ancient Greece. So this lyre was used to accompany dancing, singing or recitation of epic poetry, and epic meaning just long, like Homer's Odyssey is an epic tale. And so even though Greeks had a developed form of notation, they still didn't read music very much. It was still very much taught, word of mouth, ear to ear, that kind of thing. And so music, as always has been, was passed on in that way. So the Greeks had the largest empire the world had ever seen, and eventually the Romans took over. So Alexander the Great, he started in Greece and conquered almost the entire known world, all the way to India, I think. But then he actually died very, very early over there in India, and his kingdom was divided up into 4 generals. And they spent many years just fighting each other, the civil war. Eventually, the Romans, who were basically just farm boys who fought good, came and took over most of the known world. And the Romans liked Greek culture. When they encountered it, they decided to adopt a lot of those elements, but they also allowed others to retain their own culture. So they allowed those they conquered to still be themselves. And so, for example, this is where we find a lot of the New Testament in the context of Rome, allowing the Jewish people to still be Jewish, kind of. And there was conflicts with Jesus and all that kind of stuff, but that's what happened. And the Rome continued most of their music traditions from the Greeks, so they kind of adopted that and kept it going. So the Romans continued to develop music, but the empire was in decline by 300 AD, and the advance of music and art and all those sorts of things was halted because there was a need for other things in the kingdom. And in the 300 AD century is when the Roman Empire essentially collapsed. And we really can't find any trace of Rome's impact on modern music. They just kind of adopted Greece and kept it going. And then from here, the Christian church took over. One of the things that happened at the end of Rome's days was that they made Christianity the main religion. And so all of a sudden, all this kind of stuff happened where music was very important to the church and for everyone's well-being in religious ceremonies. So these melodies were often linked to the rhythm of lyrics. This is kind of, basic overall ancient music things. Melodies were linked to rhythm of lyrics. For example, if you've heard of Shakespearean stuff, you've probably heard of iambic pentameter, and there's a certain rhythm to those words that we'd speak. For example, we have, I went to the grocery store. There's long, short, long, and it keeps going like that, where you would sing it like that. You wouldn't go, I went to the grocery store. Like, that just doesn't make sense, and so you'd make your rhythms match up with how you would normally speak. Musicians also relied on memory and knowledge of technique rather than notation. Again, they didn't write anything down. They were just fortunate to be taught and to hear it from other people and be educated. Philosophers also knew that there was something transcendent about music, and transcendent means music worked in an orderly fashion. Everyone knew it worked and it was kind of mathematical, but it seemed to communicate something that was beyond, and that's why it was used in special ceremonies, religious worship, and those sorts of things. It seemed to connect to something that was deeper than just the physical. And the Greeks also developed a scientific approach to acoustics and well-developed theory and notation. So again, the Greeks were the first ones to try and write things down, and we have some evidence of that. And also a scientific approach to acoustics. They made, amphitheaters that one person could stand in the middle and speak, and everyone in the audience could hear them. Very well thought out things with that. And so the future, as we head into the chant and medieval time period, these traditions continued of teaching by word of mouth and hearing it, not writing it. those continued, but the Greek music disappeared, and it was sort of lost with the collapse of the Roman Empire, and it was resurrected during the Renaissance time period. So when you listen to medieval music and chant period, all of it sounds very much the same. They kind of use the same notes all the way through. There's a couple variances, but starting in the Renaissance time period, that's when they kind of rediscovered some of those Greek things, especially those scales that starts on do, starts on re, and music really started to take new avenues in there. And the biggest influence on Western music were the Babylonians and the Greeks. So as that music came in through history, and it was kind of lost, resurrected then in the Renaissance time period, those rediscoverings and rebirths of those ancient cultures really gave a very quick and fast transition into what music became, especially in the Renaissance and Baroque time periods. And from there, it just took on a whole new life of its own. So that's some things about ancient music. I hope that gives you just some things to think about for further research. Please reach out and let me know if you have any other questions.